You heard that, right? All right. So you're all officially being recorded. If you don't want your face recorded, then mute your video. So last time we talked about, started on the course Jesus the Galilean, and we in session 1, we looked primarily at the geographical context of Jesus' life, looked at videos, looked at maps, looked at satellite imagery and that sort of thing. And what I would like to do tonight is we're going to turn to some timeline study. And then we're also going to go off into Jesus' educational background, which is something that either very little has been written on, or what has been written has been lots of conjecture and kind of the world of make-believe, Jesus seminar kind of stuff, or the 2nd century Gospels that were written that thankfully did not make it into the canon of New Testament scripture. So, but I promised you on online in the email that we would start out with some Q&A or comments, discussion that would bring us up to speed, hopefully with that kind of input from your end on stuff that we covered last week. So if you have any kind of a comment that you would like to make, or ask a question about something that might be of interest to lots of other folks in the class, I'd like for you to just go ahead and depress your space bar and speak, and then release the space bar after you have finished speaking, and try to get some interaction in that way.
Dr. Nunnally, this is Pat Smith. Question out of some of what you were sharing. You painted a beautiful portrait of how Joseph and Mary would have traveled from Nazareth up and across the valley and up into the highlands and down to Bethlehem. In that portrait, you mentioned that they would be really reviewing all of these different sites and places and their whole Jewish history together as they traveled. A question popped into my mind with all of the incredible beauty of that imagery. How do we know that they would have known exactly where they were as they traveled and what they were seeing?
That's a wonderful question, Pat. Thanks for raising that. I assume that some of you may have been wondering the same thing. Some of these locations had continuous occupation. Of course, some would have been destroyed and never rebuilt, right? There is this interesting collective memory, though, of people that even when the demographics change, even when the language group changes. So, for example, during the early Arabic period, now we're talking from the conquest, the Islamic conquest in the 7th century onward, some kind of way handed down to them. There weren't any printed maps or anything like that yet, no Google Earth, but those people, even coming from a different world, speaking a different language, having a different ethnicity, they nevertheless knew where these biblical locations were. When the early pioneers, the early explorers, many of whom were Dutch, they were English, they were German, were trekking through the land of Israel, and they're writing journals as well. So we know what these guys were doing. They would go around to small Arabic-speaking villages, and they would ask them, what is that mound over there with all that pottery sticking out of the ground? And they would say, in their Arabic dialect, Beisan, which translates into Beth She'an or Beit Shan. They would ask, as we looked at last week, what is that village over there? And the occupants would say, that's my village. The name of that village is Neen, which would then translate into Nain, or as we mispronounce it, Nain, the widow of Nain. So you have this whole science that develops called toponymy, place name, location, place names. And so it often will start like that. And if people in the 7th century AD from another culture, another ethnicity, another language group who were immigrants into the country 6, 7 centuries after Jesus, if they were able to do what is this rough, toponymy, they maintained those place names, even though sometimes their pronunciation, Beisan instead of Beit Shan, developed. They nevertheless knew the biblical connections and were able to pass those on to these early explorers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we now depend so much on the groundwork that they laid 100+ years ago. Wonderful question. There are other ways to know. Inscriptions, Roman mile markers, just probably a half a dozen or so really good ways to, Eusebius's onomasticon. Eusebius is an early church father who's writing around the time of the Council of Nicaea, AD 325, and he wrote this book called Onomasticon. His best known work is Ecclesiastical History. Those of you who have been in Bible college or seminary or done a degree in whatever kind of biblical studies may have heard of that. But he wrote this lesser known work called Onomasticon, and it actually is a physical description of the land of Israel, how far it is from one location to another location, what you have to pass by to get there, how valleys and streams you have to ford, and that kind of thing. And so the onomasticon is from the early 300s AD and is a wealth of information. We also have Josephus, and Josephus gives wonderful descriptions of itineraries and the geographical layout of the land. I'll give you one example of that I actually used today when I did a video, and it has to do with with Lean Rittmeyer's discovery of, or identification of, the family tomb of the high priest Annas, or Ananus, who was the first to receive Jesus after his arrest, and then passed him on to his son-in-law, Joseph ben Caiaphas. And it's all there. He says that the Romans, when they were erecting their siege wall around the city of Jerusalem, that it ran from point A, which is the Ain Rogel, the spring of Rogel, right at the southern end of the city of David, and then it goes up to the next spot, the next geographical marker was this really monumental size tomb of the family of Annas the high priest.
Also probably true that so Jewish people were living in that land continuously even through the exile. So
right.
There are a lot of pilgrimages that are required for all Jewish men that take place every year. So Joseph had probably been taking that trip every year since he was old enough to travel.
You're right, Peyton. Is that your right name, Peyton?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, you're absolutely right. That's that part of that collective memory that people simply had because of they're speaking the language of the Bible, and they are recalling, remembering, having handed down to them by previous generations, teachers, the biblical locations and their names. I like this. What's next?
I have a question about Matthew chapter 2, when it says that when Joseph was coming back from Egypt and he heard that Archelaus was ruling, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, and he turned away from there and went to Nazareth. So it sounds like Nazareth was never his intention or intended place. is Bethlehem the place he was going to go back to, or?
I believe so. Yeah. There may have been some issues in Nazareth related to Mary's pregnancy. I can't say that for sure, but given that very traditional, very modest culture, that could very well have been. The other side of it is that when Joseph and Mary went to Egypt, they had already been living in Bethlehem with Jesus. Jesus didn't know of Nazareth for almost 2 years. And we know of this from two different kind of indicators in that Matthew chapter 2 text. One indicator is that very obvious statement that it says that Herod sent and killed all of the babies who were 2 years old and under. So Jesus is almost at his second birthday. But the other thing that we know, another way that we know this is that that Matthew only uses the technical term paideon for Jesus. And that is a Greek word. It comes from the word pedos, which means foot. It's where we get the word podiatrist and that kind of thing. Pediatrics is, treating children, PED, right? It means children who are old enough to move around by the locomotion of the feet. So Matthew only records Jesus as a toddler. As compared to, it's always good to have something to compare with, otherwise you're working in a bubble. It's a good methodology to do that. That's as compared to Luke's version of these early stories of Jesus. And Luke focuses on the birth of Jesus, the conception, the days just before the birth, and then the actual birth. And this comes out in Luke's Greek. Luke calls Jesus a brephos, which if you look in the Septuagint, that's always the Greek word that is translating the word tinok in Hebrew, and the word yanak means to suckle. So it's one who's still receiving all of his nourishment through the milk of the mother. And so Luke and Matthew, completely different time periods and completely different vocabulary used to describe the young Jesus. Here's another by the way. The earliest references that we have to the birthplace of Jesus, and this goes back into the early 2nd century AD, is that we are getting Jesus is born in a cave, and it's consistent. But when the wise men get there, it says they went into the oikos, they went into the house. So there's another indicator that we've got a considerable time gap between Luke's records and Matthew's records. And I don't know, I often have these flashbacks to my early college days. And as a freshman in college, I was attending a considerably liberal school, and I was taking Bible classes because I'd just come to trust in Jesus as my master. And I was taught by a very liberal college professor that there are so many inconsistencies in the gospel narratives that you can't trust them. One of those is, historically, is that Matthew has the wise men going into a house, whereas Luke has the shepherds visiting Jesus in a stable. So there is obviously a contradiction in scripture, right? Wrong. The wise men and the shepherds never even saw each other. They haven't a clue that the other existed, because their visits to the Holy Family are somewhere between 1.5 years and 2 years removed from one another. I think we're all afflicted by this. Over familiarity with the text then breeds inattention to the text, which is unfortunate for everybody involved.
Can you describe what you mean by cave? I've heard before about Jesus' birthplace probably being in a cave rather than in a dwelling.
Okay, so caves are quite numerous and available in the hill country of Judah for sure, but also in Samaria and places in Galilee, all along the Dead Sea coast. It's just a very cavey kind of country. little bit like Missouri now that I think about it, but just me, I guess. So we began to hear about Jesus being born in a cave, actually from a source from Eusebius and Macarius. And they're telling us that Hadrian, the emperor who put down the second Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, that he defiled the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and also the Church of the Nativity. Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And in their place, he erected temples to Adonis and a temple to Jupiter, and made those pagan worship sites. So hoping to deny access to any self-respecting Christian, because they wouldn't want to be defiled by frequenting a pagan worship site. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and mute everybody. Again, that's gonna happen from time to time. It's okay. Totally all right. I have grandkids. Hey, what can I say? I'm well broken in. And thank you, Rod. All right. So you first hear about this, these holy locations as places where Christians were going as early as the late first century into the early second century. Then they're defiled by the Emperor Hadrian somewhere in the middle 130s AD. And then you hear that these places were then reestablished as locations of Christian worship later on, from the time of Constantine and Queen Helena, his mother, who was dispatched to Israel to mark holy sites and places where there was a consistent tradition that goes all the way back to the first century and the original followers of Jesus. There's more to it, Ken, than that. There are references by people like Saint Jerome, Origen, the Bishop of Caesarea, and the like, these early Christian authors. I think even Tertullian of Carthage makes a reference to Jesus' birth in a cave, and that puts us back to, in literary sources, somewhere around AD 200, AD 180.
Yes. Now like a puppy. I love you.
All right. So again, if I got background noise, I'm going to try to go to that mute all, but just keep on. If you see me doing stuff, if you get pop-up messages, don't worry. That's you keep using your space bar. I hope that helps a little bit, Ken. I've got lots of sources. If you want literary sources on that, send me an email just to prompt my memory, and I'll copy and paste those to you. Next.
Hey, Dr. Nunnally, my name is Randall Myers. I had a question there on your discussion about the cave. I've been listening to Dr. Kenneth Bailey, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, here recently, and he postulated that the birthplace of Jesus was most likely something like a Middle Eastern house, where the cattle and other animals are kept kind of in a stall down at the one end of the house. And then there's a sloped living room structure up to the other side of the house with mangers, manger troughs at one end of the living room structure. And that Jesus was actually laid in a manger there. And he cites examples of other Middle Eastern houses, like in Syria and other places that he had been, Lebanon, I guess, particularly because that's where he grew up. So I was just curious if you took maybe Tertullian and Eusebius's theory over his, just because of the historicity of their recording, or if you had what you thought about Dr. Bailey's take on that.
Okay, so because of our wars in the Middle East, you pretty much know that Syria is not Israel in terms of its geology, and so you're not going to have the same kind of opportunities to have real naturally occurring caves in places like Syria or Iran, Iraq, because it's just not the nature of those countries. So The reason that I very much admire Kenneth Bailey's work. On the other hand, there are some methodological issues associated with his approaches to the reconstruction of New Testament realities. What would those be? Well, you can't, first of all, you can't go to Arabic culture and find the same kind of parallels with the Judaism of Jesus' day. Another thing is that modern Arab culture is not the same thing as early Arabic culture, is not the same thing as first century Jewish culture. One other methodological problem with Bailey, and again, I revere his work. I mean, he is so good to go on so much stuff. But when it comes to historical reconstruction, you can't make your primary appeals to Arabic sources. Why? Because Jesus wasn't an Arab, and because those Arabic sources are late, and because the culture that's being reflected in those Arabic sources are not the same as the first century Jewish sources that we have in the land of Israel. So where do you go? Where you go is the kind of places that we're going to go tonight when we're talking about the educational background of Jesus. You go to the earliest Jewish sources from the land of Israel that you can, and you build your historical, cultural, whatever, reconstruction on the basis of that kind of stuff, first and foremost. In the absence of all of that, if there's nothing there, just absolutely what record has been wiped clean, then okay, then you go to these ancillary sources like the way that homes are constructed in Syria, or the way that women draw water in Iraq or something, because that's all. If that's all you have, then that's the best that you can do. But for us in our world today, where you can get this, all of early rabbinic literature on this thing that we call a cell phone, and I have it. I have it in English, Hebrew, and Aramaic right here on my cell phone. It goes with me everywhere I go. Then there is no reason to make those kinds of sources our primary point of reference when we are looking for I've got to do the mute thing again, sorry.
Doctor, it's David Johnson who keeps popping up, so he must be unmuted. Perhaps you could just ask him to mute himself.
I wish I had that kind of technological ability and the ability to focus on you guys. If y'all know how to do that, or maybe somebody send a chat message or something, I would rise up in the gate and call your name blessed. All I know is to do what the trained organ grinder monkey was taught to do, and that's mute all and then let you guys run it from there. I guess maybe there's somebody jumping up and down on his space bar, but so be it. I love getting more sanctified, don't y'all?
Dr. Nunnally, this is Monty Felix. Question, this evening's readings, Hebrews 5:8 says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Am I to assume in that statement that the obedience that he suffered or the obedience that he learned as a result of his suffering was a recommitment to God and his mission on earth?
Thanks for bringing that up, Monty. It's probably not self-evident why I gave those two passages in Hebrews, because what does that have to do with the historical Jesus? I guess maybe my main point, my main jumping off point there was to simply indicate that the Jesus that was the real historical Jesus is not the Jesus that we start seeing cropping up in those early 2nd century apocryphal gospels, that he came out walking and talking, and that he was giving commands to wild animals, and they led him to Egypt, wagging their tails behind them, and that kind of thing. He's a Jesus who was born not able to feed, not able to diaper, not able to clothe, not able to protect himself. And so you have those stories early on in the Gospels that it was Mary who wrapped him in swaddling clothes. He didn't swaddle himself. It was Mary who nursed him. He didn't just, he wasn't a Gnostic and didn't need to eat or breathe or sleep or drink or anything like that. He's a real human being, and He grows into, in a developmental kind of way, the Jesus that we see full blown in his adulthood in the Gospels. So I guess that was my primary point. And I know that it doesn't cut right to the heart of, okay, well, tell me how he learned his alphabet. Tell me the sequence in which he learned his first Hebrew vocabulary words. All right, I can't do that. But I can point to these couple of passages in the book of Hebrews that demonstrate that Jesus is on a learning curve. And then, now that that's established, then we can go on and do the sort of stuff that we need to do tonight to kind of lend any degree of legitimacy that's left to this course at all after I've gotten through with a session and a quarter. But B, to be able to have a solid Christology or theological framework from which to build on in these extra biblical sources about how Jesus did develop language skills and hermeneutical or Bible interpretive skills or memorization techniques and those sorts of things. Super.
Maybe that was the God part of him that figured all that out.
Okay. All right. It's not where Hebrews is going though, right? Next.
Hi, this is Kristen Todd.
Kristen.
And there's so much evidence that Jews traveled through Samaria. So I was wondering, how did it become such a widespread view that they avoided the area?
That is also a very astute question. You guys are amazing. You should be teaching this class. I should be just listening. I should be taking notes. Super question. Thank you. First of all, it is ignorance of the sources. We don't not only do not know the sources, we don't know those sources even exist. I'm as bad about that as myself. When I went for my face-to-face doctoral interviews, one of the interviews was with Dr. Edward Goldman, who's a professor of Midrash at Hebrew Union College. And he said, stand on that chair over there and grab that copy of Mechilta Rabbi Ishmael up there on the top shelf. And the first thing I thought was, what in the world is Mechilta Rabbi Ishmael? I'd never heard of it before. Come to find out, it is a majorly important source of rabbinic literature. So I'm there. Another thing is, we assume that these sources are either late or they're not written by Christians, so they can't teach us anything. I'll let y'all be the judge of it. Get to the end of the class, look at all the stuff that we're going to look at, and you decide, is buying a English copy of the Mishnah or the Tosefta worth it? Is it worth it reading Josephus? Is it worth it reading Philo of Alexandria? And then and you make that decision, and that will kind of set your course for where you go after this class is over. Another thing, I don't even really want to talk about this, Kristen, so I'm going to put this on your shekel. All right, this is everybody, this is Kristen's fault. Another reason why these sources are not accessed any more often than they are is simply either latent or blatant anti-Semitism. Now, how do I know this? I'll give you one example, and then we got to go on to somebody else's question. You folks that are in pastoral positions all over the world or whatever, if you want to just raise your hand like this, how many of you have ever heard of Theological Dictionary of the New Testament? Let me see them hands. Come on, get them up. Nobody looking around, every eye closed, every head bowed. Don't want to embarrass anybody. Okay, so you know about TDNT. TDNT is virulently anti-Semitic. And why is that? Well, look at the people who are writing it. They're almost all Germans. That doesn't mean that they're bad, but Gerhard Kittel was a card-carrying SS member. His brother Rudolf Kittel was also a card-carrying SS member. Read the article, for example, on, I can't remember what the word is, but I think it's Mesotoikon. It only shows up in the New Testament maybe once. It's that middle wall of partition, mesotoikon tu phragmu. And what you'll find, they'll quote all of the legitimate ancient sources, but after they tell you, yeah, we know about these, we know that stuff's out there in First Maccabees, we know that stuff is out there in Mishnah Midot, but then they'll say, but we know that that can't be what Paul is talking about because he'd already gone far beyond the Judaism that had so oppressed him. And statements like that that are just, whoa, wait a minute, where did that come from? Just give me the ancient sources, point me in the right direction and leave me alone. Let me read the sources. Let me make my decision about, is this Paul tapping into his knowledge of ancient Judaism and the world of the temple? Or is this something that he's just having some kind of a literary flight of fancy? Turns out that they're wrong and Paul's right. The archaeology is all there. The ancient sources are all right, like they usually are. And it's TDNT that's messed up. So there is a various versions or degrees of anti-Semitism. And maybe I would even add to that triumphalism on the side of, on the Christian side, that we have superseded, we're better than, and therefore these ancient Jewish sources, whether they're intertestamental sources or Dead Sea Scrolls or rabbinic literature or Josephus, Philo, whatever, what can they teach us? I mean, after all, they're intentionally unbelievers, right? And so like, okay, so we can't learn anything from scientists who aren't Christian. I can't benefit, my teeth can't benefit from a dentist who's not a Christian. I mean, that logic it just escapes me. But those are the kinds of games that have been played, and that's where we are, Kristen. Great question. Let's take one more, and then we're going to go on to some questions that I have for you. Turnabout's always fair play in my classes.
I had some questions about when I started to read the literature in here about whether Jesus was legitimate or illegitimate when he was born. One said that he was illegitimate, and then the other one said that when Mary got to Joseph's family's house, then that meant they were married. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? All right, so on the illegitimate side, there are rabbinic sources that say that Jesus was the illegitimate son of Miriam. They use the Hebrew version of Marias that we get Mary in the Greek Gospels. By the way, Luke will only use that Hebraic, the more Hebraic form. He uses Mariam. Invariably, Luke does. And so that she had some sort of sexual liaison with a Roman soldier whose name was Panther, and that she was put out by Joseph for sex before marriage, and not with him, but somebody else. And that while Mary was wandering disgracefully, she secretly bore Jesus. So you do have ancient sources saying that. You have it intimated in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, where the religious leaders have accosted Jesus and they say, we know who our Father is. Now you hear the insinuation in that statement, right? The insinuation is, but you don't. You guys ever wondered why Jesus didn't get married? Never mind with the Jesus Seminar and all these other specials that get run every Easter, and Christmas about Jesus marrying Mary Magdalene and all this stuff. There's no evidence of that anywhere. It's all conjecture and speculation and weirdness. But you ever wondered why Jesus did not get married? You ever wondered why John the Baptist never got married? Have you ever wondered why Paul wasn't married? I mean, these are three very prominent Jewish people, right? and they had taken a leadership position. But the requirement within rabbinic Judaism was that a person marry and that they have children. The house of Hillel said that you had to have one of each sex to replicate God's creation works with Adam and Eve, right? Chava. See what I did with that? All right. Shammai, the more exacting version of Pharisaism, said, nope, one of each sex is not enough. You got to have 2 children that are male and 2 children that are female, just in case, because of infant mortality and that kind of thing, one of those 2 boys and one of those 2 girls doesn't survive to adulthood. So the biggest reason for getting married, it's not just getting married, but it's procreation, to replicate the acts of God in creation. It's the imagio Dei, the imitation of, or imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. So that's kind of lost my train of thought now. Where are we going? Oh, why these guys aren't getting married? Most of the Essenes didn't get married. Did you know that? There's a whole group of Jews that Philo of Alexandria describes living in Egypt. They're called the Therapeutae because they had gifts of healing. Therapeutae, we know that word, therapeutic, right? Therapy, etc. And then there are people even within the rabbinic community. There's a very prominent rabbi, his name is Shimon ben Azai, and he was accosted by his contemporaries. Why aren't you getting married? You are a Jewish adult, you are of age, you need to be marrying and having children. And he said, in Hebrew, my soul is in love with the Torah. Let others perpetuate the world. Rock on, man. That is all of that is some cool stuff. We're hearing about the Essenes, we're hearing about the Therapeutae, and now we're even hearing within the rabbinic community, within the land of Israel itself, the Hebrew-speaking community within the land of Israel, among the intelligentsia, the leadership, people like Shimon ben Azai who are not marrying for various reasons. His is, I'm so engaged with this world of the Bible, I don't have time for wife and kids. Sorry, wife and kids. Hey, you know what? I've got a question. Why don't we talk about this stuff at church? You ever wondered why it is that these kinds of questions don't even come up at church, much less get any airtime?
People are not knowledgeable.
Sorry, Rod.
Most ministers aren't trained. They don't have any clue. They're not educated in that area.
Well, present company excluded though, brother.
Seminaries aren't focusing at all on this material either.
That's a great point. Last week I noted, and I hope you guys picked up on it.
I agree.
I made this statement. There is not one Bible college, there's not one university Bible program, there's not one seminary that requires the study of historical and physical geography of the land of Israel. Not one. In this country, in the United States. Now, JUC obviously does. In fact, that's where my love for this kind of stuff was birthed, was at JUC. But you know, you can't say, well, yeah, that's an American Bible college, because it's not really a Bible college and it's not really American. Other than that, that statement is totally true. All right, I got some questions for y'all.
I think that often as Christians, we want to have the answers and not questions, and we're uncomfortable with having questions. And so that's why we don't talk about these things.
I think you're right. And I think the ability, first of all, the freedom to ask the question, and then the ability to kind of articulate the right question, and then the methodology to start addressing evidentially that question. Those are all largely missing. Why? I think it goes back to our experience in public education, because we're taught to regurgitate rather than we are taught to think critically, think carefully, think analytically, think evidentially. But that's a subject for another issue, another time. Thank you, Mary Jean. I have a couple of questions for you. It's all starts out with this basic premise, the basic question. What was the nature of first century Galilee? Talking about Jesus the Galilean, right? That's starting off with a good question, isn't it? So maybe let's divide this up into bits and pieces because it's an absolutely gigantic subject. What for those of you who read in the scholarly or critical literature or whatever, what are most people saying about like John Mayer, etc.? What are they saying about first century Galilee? John Dominic Crossan, Burton Mack. What are we hearing from the higher critical school about the nature of first century Galilee? And by the way, you can go all the way back to the beginning of the previous century, and folks are saying largely the same thing. In Galilee of Jesus' time, it was like this. What do you usually hear?
I don't know about the different names you said, but a lot of what I hear is there was a lot of messianic hope. And so there's a lot of different potential Messiah figures and then various zealots around them that cropped up in that time period.
All right, that's good. That's good. What about things like linguistically or culturally or in terms of their Jewish identity or orientation, the degree of observance, you know, in observing their Judaism? How meticulous or careful are they about things like Sabbath observance, ritual purity, Jewish education for their children, circumcision, proper Jewish wedding, traditional Jewish morals, those sorts of things. What was it like? What was the economic picture like in the Galilee of Jesus' day? What was the ethnic makeup breakdown of Galilee? Those sorts of questions. Any ideas about any of that stuff, guys?
Galilee was like the Berkeley of its day, hotbed place of radical thought, less traditional than Jerusalem. Jerusalem, they wanted to keep things the way they were. People would think radical thoughts like Berkeley from the 60s in the United States.
Very interesting. Thank you, Matt. And you're right. That's totally there. Other pieces of this scholarly pie. Philip?
I've heard from more or less from a lay perspective over the years that Galilee was like a backwater. They were not well thought of.
Yes.
It's like they were back Hicks. Again, that's not from a scholarly perspective, but just from readings here and there from the popular literature that I've come across.
Yeah, a lot of that is piggybacking on this word that shows up in the book of Acts, that these people are Galileans and they're agrammatus. They're not well trained in rhetoric or proper Greek grammar. But you're right, that's out there. Other pieces of the pie, guys?
Geographically, Galilee's more connected to the rest of the world than Judea, which is kind of set off in the hills. So there was more mixing of other influences potentially.
Yes. Okay. So you have what we saw last week, that Jezreel Valley. That's what I call, it's the main intersection or junction of the north. Kind of like the Central Benjamin Plateau is for down south, just north of Jerusalem, is a major junction point for roads coming in and going out from every direction. And it's the trade route kind of thing. It's what Isaiah calls the way of the sea. And so he calls in Isaiah chapter 9, he refers to Galilee as Galil HaGoyim. And I think that most of you know, Galil is Galilee. Do you know, can you hear this? HaGoyim, the nations or Gentiles. You know what a goy is, right? Okay, a goy is a non-Jew typically, although Genesis chapter 12 God promises Abraham, he says, I'm going to make you into a goy gadol. Israelis still laugh about that. Is the father Abraham, the father of all Jews, is going to be a big goy, big pagan, a big unbeliever, a big non-Jew. But it's just a different way that words are being used. So this Galil HaGoyim is Galilee of, as you said, Rachel, the nations. They are coming through there by the droves because of the caravan trade and because of transcontinental migrations from Africa to Europe and Asia, following the main trade route, which is Isaiah's way of the sea. Cuts right through the heart of the Jezreel Valley to the north side of the Sea of Galilee and on up in that direction to places further north like Dan and Damascus and on to the Fertile Crescent or down to Egypt going the other direction. So question though, this is where I'm going to begin my critique. Is that okay? People who are passing through a town don't necessarily kind of set the agenda culturally. They stop and they gas up their camel and they keep on trucking. It's kind of like us passing through. I've been through Indianapolis, Indiana, probably 6 times in my life, going back and forth east to west. And I usually stop there. Sometimes it's Terre Haute and we get gas. And I don't have any impact on that culture at all, except that I've left a few shekels there to pay for the gas, maybe a candy bar. So then there's a difference between passing through and being permanent residents, right? So then what we've got to do is we've got to get down into the Galilee of Jesus' day. And what that means is you can't stop at the Byzantine level of an archaeological excavation. Why is that? Jesus wasn't a Byzantine. He wasn't living in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries AD. He's living in the 1st century. So this is not the Christianized Roman Empire, of the 300s, 400s, 500s AD, 600s AD, all the way till the Islamic conquest that Jesus is growing up in and then functioning in later as an adult. Rather, when you go down, when you pierce the Byzantine level and you go down into 1st century, you begin to find a really different scenario. You find a very much Judaized Galilee. Moti or Mordechai Aviam is one of the foremost excavators, archaeologists of the Galilee, and specifically of 1st century Galilee. And I've been in several of his, I've been around and worked with him several times with very large groups. And he has given presentations, and he has literally hundreds of exclusively Jewish villages that he has done topographical surveys, or he's done actual excavations, spades in the dirt kind of thing. And it's amazing how Jewish Galilee was. It's also interesting that in this Galilee of the time of Jesus, you see coming out of the ground all over the place, mikvaot, things that aren't used by Gentiles. They are ritual immersion baths. We would call them baptistries. You guys comfortable with that? A ritual immersion bath, or a mikveh, that is used exclusively by Jews for the purpose of regaining ritual purity. That is a level of Jewish observance there. You find mikvaot as prevalent in the Galilee as you do in Judea. Another thing, the Galilee that is supposed to be mostly Greek speaking, we find out that all of a sudden that myth evaporates, as does largely the Aramaic myth as well. And that most of the inscriptions, when you go back to the 1st century, are indeed in Hebrew. You also find some very interesting things in terms of literature. You find that once the Sanhedrin has to leave Jerusalem because it's destroyed in AD 70, where does it go? It goes to the Galilee. It goes to places like Sepphoris, Usha, Beit Sha'arim, and ultimately Tiberias. These are all Galilean cities. What is a Jewish high court doing cavorting around Galilee if it's not comfortable in its Jewish identity there? Well, the point is, that's a rhetorical question. It is comfortable because of the Jewish identity there. You have the Mishnah, the earliest and in some sense most authoritative Jewish document that was completed in Sepphoris, or in Hebrew, Tzipori. That's 3.4 miles northwest of Nazareth. It's in Galilee. It's in the heart of Galilee. You find the Jerusalem Talmud, the earliest of the two Talmuds, that is finalized in Tiberias, which has, by the time it was finalized, has become a big-time Jewish city, not the pagan city that it was in Jesus' day. And you also find some of the earliest and best copies made by ancient scribes of the Hebrew Bible coming out of the Galilee, like the city of Tiberias. For example, the Aleppo Codex, that is quite famous. You can look it up online if you're not familiar with it, but it's in, what's left of it is in the basement of the Shrine of the Book now in Jerusalem. So the idea about Galilee being completely Hellenized or dominated by Gentile demographics, the idea that it's culturally and linguistically largely Greek, the idea that the people are poor and live hand to mouth, the idea that it's either Greek speaking or at least Aramaic speaking, the idea that this area is less observant than the area in the land of Judea or Judah. These are the foundations of constructs from yesteryear that are being greatly eroded, largely by new archaeological discoveries, and then by more legitimate assessments of ancient literature and that kind of thing. I wanted to mention one more point, and that was this idea of being less observant. When you look in the Mishnah and the Tosefta, the two earliest texts two earliest collections of material from the early rabbis, they come from around the year 200 and 220 AD, something like that. The rabbinic authorities that give the most rulings on halakha, or the way that you're supposed to live your life as an observant Jew, are from Galilee, not Judea. Absolutely fascinating, isn't it? That one reality, which is incontrovertible because it's simply there in the Mishnah and the Tosefta, is that you look at these rabbis who are the most authoritative, who are giving the most halachic, or how you live your life as an observant Jew, rulings, are largely Galilean. You also hear about, and we're going to hopefully get to tonight, if not the next week, this movement within Galilee that is called the movement of the Hasidim. The Hasidim are or the Anshe Ma'aseh, the men of great deeds, are men who are kind of charismatic, wonder-working rabbis in the first century, early second century, first century BC, first century AD, and early second century. And they're almost exclusively Galileans. These guys who are kind of leading the way in terms of this very charismatic, very, supernaturally oriented, highly revered people that other rabbis will bow down to in the presence of. This is an almost exclusively Galilean movement. It's absolutely fascinating. I think that it had a tremendous influence on our subject, Jesus the Galilean. Anyway, comments or questions before we go to the next section in my stuff?
Can you tell us about Nathaniel's question? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? What was Nathaniel's bias?
You know, I wish that I had one of those Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure kind of telephone booths where you could fly around to different times and places. Yeah, maybe in the next iteration of, artificial intelligence or virtual reality. But anyway, I'd like to pick Nathaniel's brain a little bit too on that. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that there are no rabbinic authorities that are said to, Rabbi Yossi Minatzeret or something like that, Rabbi Joseph of Nazareth. There aren't any. It could also be that Nazareth is, I've forgotten who it was, maybe it was Philip, who said that Galilee was just Poduntville, it was Hicktown. Well, Nazareth kind of was. I'm not saying all of Galilee was like that, but Nazareth was way off the beaten path. If you look at ancient maps and you look where the Old Testament roads and where the New Testament roads are plotted, they all run around the Nazareth Ridge. None of them go across it or, from like southwest to northeast and kind of traverse the whole thing. They just aren't there. So you don't get this any kind of much traffic flow through Nazareth. It's basically only locals. And I think everybody must have known this who was living in and around Galilee at the time. They knew that Nazareth never grew more than, James Strange gives the population maximum at Nazareth based on the amount of water from the spring that's available and from the size of the town as defined by graveyard type stuff, because that's outside the city limits, as being 400 maximum. So it's a tiny village. Give you an example, Capernaum dwarfs Nazareth, ancient Nazareth. Not today, but ancient Nazareth. Sippori dwarfs ancient Nazareth. So it was not necessarily a mark in your honor to be able to say, yes, I come from Nazareth. Any more than I guess it was for Elijah to say, I'm from Tishbe. It's like, so what? Kind of thing. That may be the attitude of Nathaniel. Nathaniel, I believe, Philip found Nathaniel, and Philip was from, I think, Bethsaida, Galilee, north of the lake, by just a couple of hundred meters. And Bethsaida had been just fabulously rebuilt by Herod Philip, the youngest surviving son of Herod the Great, who was ruling on the east side of the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee stuff. And it was a marvelous city. It was a beautiful city, a real city. Nazareth had fewer people than the little town that my wife came from in very rural central Mississippi. By the way, her dad passed away this morning, and I would covet your prayers as we travel there tomorrow, first thing tomorrow morning, do the funeral service and try to minister to the family as well as my own wife. I would appreciate that from you guys.
Can we pray for you now?
If you'd like, Robbie.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. Jesus, thanks so much, Wave and his family. Thank you for this opportunity for Dr. Nunnally to go and minister to his family. Bind him up, guide him.
Thank you, Lord.
Give him everything he needs to proclaim Christ crucified, died, buried, and resurrected to give us life. Lord, help him to preach resurrection, your resurrection life in his family,
Yes, Lord.
To wear both those hats well in terms of being a minister, being a husband, and even being a griever, Lord. We know that death is the enemy and an unwelcome guest, and that you will have it done away with and the enemy put in his place as you make all things new. Yes. And so we pray that you usher in resurrection as you proclaim that through your servant this week. Bless their travels, give them safety,
Thank you,
give
Lord.
them everything they need. Bind up this family, bind up their brokenheartedness, comfort them in their grief, and encourage them in your resurrection. We pray, amen. Come, Lord Jesus.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Robbie. I appreciate that. And thanks to you guys for undertaking that in prayer for us. Thank you. Thanks, Cindy. I appreciate that note. I'd like to change gears for just a second, share a screen, and I would like to go to this timeline and just kind of pick it at that a little bit to give us a chronological grid to work with as we move forward in our material. Are you able to see that, guys?
Yes.
Somebody say yes. Okay. All right. I'm also going to go ahead and go full screen with it. All right. Is it obscured in any way by thumbnail pictures of people in the class or of my control panel?
No.
No. All right. I think I'm going to sneak that up in the upper right-hand corner. All right. So, and I'm going to minimize this as well. So let's see. Come on. All right. You know, at the end of the Hebrew Bible period, which is about 420 BC, can you see are you able to see my pointer also on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, 420 BC has Malachi, which is, or maybe Nehemiah, somebody is right here at the end of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament period. And so now from this point on in this timeline, we're dealing with BC dates, but pre-Christian dates, pre-New Testament dates. So, and these are just really, really rough and basic times. You know, 332 is probably when Alexander the Great got to the land of Israel, but that's, you know, it's not an issue. So Alexander the Great in 333, his kingdom breaks up within 12 years. And you have the Ptolemies, the rulers, the Greek rulers in Egypt who are in control of the land of Israel, all the way up until around the year 200 BC, when the Mesopotamian Greeks, the Seleucids, the kind of the spiritual or whatever political descendants of King Seleucus I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, takes over the land of Israel. So you have this going on. Greek arrives in the land, not just the language, but also the culture, Hellenistic culture. And so pretty soon, not long after that, you have a need for the Septuagint. About the year 250, you have the Essenes are saying, we don't want any part of this Hellenism. They opt out, and you have the beginning of the movement that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls somewhere around 250 BC, based on orthographic or the nature of handwriting, and Frank Moore Cross's dating of works like 4QMMT. You also have at this time, you've got pseudepigraphical material and also apocryphal stuff. And I'm talking about the Old Testament. That's why I have it underlined there, the Old Testament Apocrypha. So you've got tons of literature being generated here, and what we've been calling for thousands and thousands of years, the silent years. And so that for that reason, when I teach or preach or whatever, I refer to them as the not so silent years. And I guess I'm just contrarian like that. But some of the earliest stuff, you have the book of Tobit, you have the book of First Enoch. These are 3rd and even late 4th century BC documents that are coming just on the heels of Malachi. In the second or late 3rd, early 2nd century BC, you've got the book of Jubilees, the book of Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, or just Sirach, or whatever you want to call it. In other words, it's just it's a very turbulent time in terms of what's going on politically and militarily, but it's also a very prolific time of literature generation. And not long after the Seleucids took over, you know, it's within a generation. You have Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and you have what we call the Maccabean Revolt or the Hasmonean Revolt that starts in 167, and within 3 years, Jerusalem has been reconquered, the temple has been rededicated, and you hear these proclamations in First and Second Maccabees about celebrating the first Hanukkah, which the word Hanukkah means rededication. You hear about it in John chapter 10 about Jesus making a special trip during the winter when the rains are there and it's hard to travel, and Jesus does it anyway for a minor, not one of the major feasts of the law of Moses, the Torah. Let's see. Then we skip to after about 100 years of Maccabean or Hasmonean rule, you have the arrival of Rome as a military force in the land of Israel, ostensibly to put down a civil war between the remaining two Maccabean rulers, two brothers that are vying for the position of king or the ruler of the Jewish ethnicity. And so Roman rule is then permanent from 63 BC all the way into the Byzantine period, all the way out to the 600s AD. During this period, you have the rise of a guy named Herod, who was not ethnically Jewish, but his grandparents and parents were converts, Edomite converts. And so Herod gets himself proclaimed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 BC, but it takes him 3 years to conquer his own country because the people didn't want any part of him. He eventually addresses that problem in a very catastrophic kind of way. It was the Pharisees that taught that he shouldn't be king because in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, when you appoint a king from among your brethren, and they were interpreting that as being ethnically Jewish, and he was not. It's during this time that you get Jesus' birth, which probably takes place around 7 or 6 BC. I know that we've got this year 0 here. I don't know if I told you this last week. I can't remember if I did or not, but I got this paper one time from an undergraduate student, and then the first sentence was so memorable that I memorized it. It says, in the year 0000, on December the 25th, Jesus Christ was born of his parents, Joseph Christ and Mary Christ. At that point, I had to stop reading for a minute because my head was hurting, but I got over that, kind of. Anyway, why would we say 7 BC, 6 BC? Because we know that Herod died, according to the reference in Josephus, that he died in the spring of 4 BC. So if Jesus was born and Herod was still around and Herod tried to kill him, it's got to be before 4 BC, right? So how much before 4 BC? Well, it was probably around the 2-year mark, because of that same reference we were discussing earlier in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2, where it talks about that he sent and killed all of the children who were 2 years old and under. So if you take 4 and you do simple math, you add 2 years to it, then Jesus' birth was probably somewhere around 6 or 7 BC. Jumping to the days where he first shows up in Jerusalem, if he was age 12, this is really interesting because Archelaus, we talked about him last week, so I'm not going to reiterate that. He was so cutthroat that the Romans couldn't put up with him. And after 10 years in office, from 4 BC to AD 6, Archelaus is deposed and sent into exile by the Romans. And it's at that point that Jesus shows up for the first time, according to the Gospel of Luke, when he comes for Passover along with Joseph and Mary. By the way, I mentioned in that article, I believe, that you read about the Christmas and the importance of family or something like that, that Mary did not have to make that long journey from Nazareth to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, because the Torah, the law of Moses, only requires adult males to make that journey. But Mary was so observant, there you get observant Judaism in Galilee, was so observant that she went and didn't even have to. It's really pretty cool stuff there. So from 6 BC to 6 AD gives you 12 years old when Jesus shows up in the temple. So this dating, even though we can't prove any of this stuff except the 4 BC date, that really commends itself to me. I didn't come up with it. I just am kind of a latecomer to the party and basically agree with it. Then from that point on, you have the crucifixion of Jesus, and scholars are in basic disarray and disagreement on the exact date of Jesus' crucifixion. Some will place it as early as 27. Others will place it as early as 27. Others will place it as late as AD 33. If that's the case and Jesus was born in 7 BC, this means that Jesus died not when he was 30 or 33 or whatever, but he died when he was 40. There are other suggestions based on astronomical data from China that suggest that he may have been born as early as 12 BC. If that's the case, then Jesus would have been 45 when he died, if you take the outside date of AD 33. This is exceptionally interesting to me because the average date, the average lifespan of an adult, of a Jewish male in Jesus' day was about 53 years old. If that's the case and Jesus is 45, and then he's in the last decade of his life, even in a normal lifespan of 53 years. That as an older gentleman at this point in my life, that to me is very appealing, because if the book of Hebrews says that he was tempted in all points, or in all points as we are, and yet without sin, that Jesus may have actually gone through every major developmental stage of the human life cycle, from embryo to infant to toddler to young boy to young teenager, late teenager, young man, middle-aged man, older man. And I don't know, to me, that's just, again, I can't prove that, but that's just interesting to me. All right, we have down at the bottom, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, who are the surviving sons of Herod the Great. He killed all of his other children, and male children, and he killed all of his 10 wives as well. So he's a very cutthroat guy that doesn't even trust his own family, much less babies born in Bethlehem who are being proclaimed King of the Jews. So I have no problem believing in the historicity of the Matthean report in chapter 2. At any rate, Archelaus gets Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Antipas gets Galilee and the land what is beyond the Jordan, called Perea in Latin. And Philip gets the areas northeast of the Sea of Galilee and northeast and east of the Sea of Galilee. And if you want to take a look at a very simple map like we used last week, then you have Archelaus, the oldest of the children, surviving children, getting all of this area: Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. Then you have Antipas getting Galilee and Perea. Okay, the Decapolis, this area that's flesh tone, is free and is under no Herodian ruler. They rule themselves and report directly to Rome. Are free from most taxes and military conscription and stuff like that. And then in this kind of almost kind of orange color, this is the area of Herod Philip, the youngest of the surviving sons of Herod the Great. So would you like to press on to some post-Jesus dates, or is this, since it's Jesus the Galilean, do you want to stop? I guess it would be legal for us to stop here.
Please keep going.
Press on.
You think? All right. So in AD 49, maybe 50, you start getting the first of the New Testament books like Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The gospel period is probably, at least the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are 50 to 70-ish. Other people are going to press that on out to 80, and some people even 85. I'm real comfortable with a 50 to 7 a pre-destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem date because there's no reference to it there. Something that cataclysmic, according to J.T. Robinson, would have to have been recorded in the literature. AD 90 is probably the end of the New Testament period with the Gospel of John. We hear from the early church father Clement of Alexandria in AD 180. Last of all, John, urged by his disciples and moved upon by the Holy Spirit, composed, aware that the outward facts had already been set forth of Jesus' life, had already been set forth in the other gospels, composed a spiritual gospel. I'm paraphrasing, but that's almost word for word in the English. So then you also have this supposed Council of Jamnia, which is actually a myth. There was never a council. There was a meeting in a home of a rabbi in Yavna or Jamnia. And this is where they were having a discussion about the contents of the Hebrew Bible. No, there were no votes taken, no books were included that weren't before, and no books were excluded that had been before. They're just asking, why are certain books like Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs included in the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures? Mishnah, AD 200, Tosefta, the additions to the Mishnah, just a half a generation later. The Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud, in 400, the Talmud Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud, about AD 500-ish. You have New Testament Apocrypha, the stuff that didn't make it into the New Testament for obvious reasons. It's coming from the 2nd century AD. And the early church fathers, who began as early as Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, who writes back in the 90s and was born around AD 60. He's a direct disciple of John the Apostle. And then you have Clement of Rome, one of the co-workers with Paul, who writes the book of First Clement in AD 95. So you've got early church fathers starting as early as the late 1st century. And then they continue on out into, like St. Augustine in the late 400s and early 500s AD. I hope that gives you just a basic kind of a framework, or, bare bones kind of sketch of what we are looking at as far as the chronology of Jesus' times before and then just a little bit after. Okay, I would like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to share screen again, because I want to get into some of this stuff that we have for background.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Can you remind us when the canonization of the Hebrew Bible and the canonization of the New Testament was, please? Just refresh us with that.
Canonization of the Hebrew Bible. I have a handout on this. My opinion is that it's happening in the late 4th or early 3rd century BC. The reason for that, well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons is that you've got statements by 2nd Maccabees, Josephus, Philo, material in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've got the canon that's represented in the Septuagint and stuff like that. That's basically pushing the time way back before AD 90. And Jesus and Paul and the early rabbis, John the Baptist and others, they knew what was in their Bible and what was not. And so I'm at considerable variance with about 95% of scholarship on this. But the canon of the Hebrew Bible did not coalesce in AD 90 at the Council of Jamnia or Yavna. It has to have predated that by almost a half a millennium. Then as far as the New Testament canon goes, we're told by geniuses like Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, and then the movie was based on his book, that the canon of the New Testament was decided in AD 325 at the Council of Nicaea under the influence of the Christianized Roman Emperor Constantine. The problem with that, again, is it makes for a great story, and it makes for a new millionaire and a fascinating movie. But it's a theory in search of evidence, because what we have is the statements of early church fathers, going all the way back to people like Clement of Rome that I mentioned in AD 95, who's already quoting the Gospels as being equal in authority with the Old Testament scriptures. So for him, the Gospels are functioning as canonical, as divinely inspired, and as authoritative for the early Christian community. You have other references in, Saint Ignatius of Antioch, the martyr, who was martyred in, I think it was AD 117. You've got the letter of Polycarp that goes back to the 100 and teens, and these guys are quoting New Testament scriptures and stuff, and they're quoting them authoritatively. In other words, as being equal in authority with the book of Isaiah or Deuteronomy or Psalms. And so you have a functional canon that was existing in the Mediterranean basin by the end of the first quarter of the 2nd century, i.e. 125 AD. So again,
Professor, I just wanted to add, I think Peter himself actually attributes Paul's writings.
That's correct.
To scripture. Is that correct?
You are exactly right. Yeah. So even within the New Testament times, we're already getting references to material that's being generated by apostolic figures like Paul as having divine sanction and authority. So yeah, you're exactly right. Like they quote, they distort the letters of our beloved brother Paul and the rest of the scriptures. Yeah, so you do get that in the writings of Peter the Apostle. I wanted to take about 5 or 10 minutes if I could. I know that we're running short on time, but I really appreciate the interaction that we've had tonight, and would like to continue that in the future. But I do want to get into some of Jesus' early education, if I could. And there's no better place to go than the very documents from the time of before, during, and just after Jesus' days that originate in the land of Israel and in Hebrew. So the first little section is on memorization. You have this phrase that you hear about sometimes in Hebrew, both rabbinic and modern Hebrew, Torah sheba'al peh. It means the Torah that is by way of the mouth. So you're dealing with two different Torahs. You're dealing with an oral Torah, and you're dealing with the written Torah of the prophet Moses, right? And a lot of you guys have heard this kind of stuff. Have I shared screen? I did, didn't I?
Yes.
You're able to see this. So the first little phrase is, there is an oral Torah. Well, how do you read an oral Torah? You don't. You memorize it. Also, the word Mishnah. It comes from the root, which most Hebrew words derive from a 3-letter root, SH, and then N, and then H on the end. So Shana. It's like the Rosh Hashanah, right? The head of the year or new year. And you call Shana that because years repeat themselves. Well, the word Mishnah means the learning by repetition. You also hear about the traditions of the elders. Well, that's actually what Jesus called it. This is that Torah sheba'al peh, the traditions. He's not talking about the written word of God. He's talking about the traditions of the elders, the leaders of the people that is being handed down by word of mouth. Also, Paul refers to this, the traditions of my fathers. There's actually a tractate in the Mishnah called Avot, Fathers. Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers. So this is well known. What Jesus and Paul are referring to is well-known stuff. This is stuff that is that Torah sheba'al peh, the oral Torah that is circulating in Jesus and Paul's day. How is it circulating? Not in written form, but rather is being passed on by word of mouth and being memorized as it is being spoken. So then, how how do we account for, we claim that our gospels are accurate. In fact, we claim that the gospels are giving us the very words of Jesus. How does that happen if you have Jesus who's speaking in the late 20s, maybe early 30s, but then you don't have gospels that are written down for at the very least 20 years. And on the outside, like with the Gospel of John, we're talking about some 60 years or so. In fact, a whole lifespan, 53 plus years in between. It's called the oral stage. And evidently these teachings of Jesus are being passed along orally. Well, people who are more liberally oriented will say, and that's where all these miracle stories and all these exorcism stories and all these these teachings of Jesus were put on Jesus' lips by the later church. And nobody could really remember what Jesus actually said. So they just kind of made up stuff and put those words on Jesus' lips. My question is, how would they ever come up with a literary device like parable? It's not a Greek literary form. It's exclusively Hebrew, exclusively Hebrew. You only find parable in Hebrew literature. You don't get it from the Aramaic speaking rabbis of Babylon. You don't get it from Aesop. He gave fables, not parables. So what about the prayers of Jesus? How do we know, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Amen. You know, where do we get that stuff? People heard it and people memorized it, and then people eventually wrote that down. It's either that or our gospels are made up. You can't have it both ways. So what about when Jesus quotes the Hebrew Bible? Do you ever see Jesus and he raised the back of his robe, whipped out his camo-colored Gideon Torah scroll and read to them? You never hear that. Jesus quotes word for word and he does it at will. He does it freely, easily, you know, with great ease. Paul does the same thing. Just as a by the way, I know this is not Paul the Asia Minor or Tarsician, but what's good for Jesus is good for Paul on this too. Well, how does this happen? And I'm going to leave you. We'll probably pick at this a little bit more next week when we get together. There is some fascinating rabbinic texts that I want you to look at. But the way that this is done today, for those of you who have been in Israel or you know a little bit of Hebrew, there are these rabbinical schools that are still in operation called yeshivot. It's a place where you go and you sit and you repeat and repeat and repeat until you memorize. Then you move to the next tractate of the Talmud or whatever. You people ask this question, well, how in the world could people remember such vast quantities of literature, you know, like the sayings of Jesus or whatever, a whole gospel, like the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Luke, the longest of the Gospels when you do word count. How could that happen in reality? Because we can't remember our middle name or our social security number. The last word on your screen is the name of my doctor father who passed away a few years ago. He was a Holocaust survivor from Warsaw, Poland. His name is Benzion Wacholder. May his memory always be blessed. He grew up in Orthodoxy, and as a young child, much like it would have happened in Jesus' day, we will see this in those texts that I expose you to next week. When he was a young child, he was dropped off at the synagogue and he was taught his alphabet, and then he was taught how to read, beginning using the book of Leviticus, just like in Jesus' day. Because it's so repetitious. It's kind of like see spot, run, see Dick, run, see Jane, run, see spot, Dick and Jane, run. That's kind of, you go over these sacrifices and various things in the book of Leviticus, and it's really neat to learn Hebrew that way because it's so repetitious. It reinforces what you've already learned. Anyway, he was dropped off as a young child. By the time I knew him, he was legally blind. But Dr. Wacholder had developed such an unbelievable memory that he knew he did his PhD in Greek classical literature. He knew all of Greek classical literature in the original language by heart. He knew the whole Hebrew Bible by heart. He knew all of the Babylonian Talmud by heart. He knew the Jerusalem Talmud by heart. He knew the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and all of the Midrash collections. He knew all of those by heart. And when I was working with him as a graduate assistant, along with a couple of other guys, we began to work on this 40% of the Dead Sea Scroll, 45% of the Dead Sea Scrolls that hadn't been published yet. And when we would print off a new text, we would take the text to him and we would read it. He's never read it before because he's blind and it hasn't been published yet. We just printed this off on our own printer in my buddy's kid's bedroom, kind of thing. And so he would stop us at points and he would say, is that spelled with an aleph or an ayin? Because he was memorizing the spelling as we went. At the end of a whole page or 2 pages, he would say, okay, boys, you know I'm an old man now. Let me repeat what you read me to make sure that I have it right. And he would quote the whole document to us, word for word, having only heard it one time. I want to ask you, I'm out of time, but this is an important question. I want to ask you this. What does that say, knowing that people were memorizing these gigantic quantities of oral Torah in Jesus' day, and I'll prove that to you next week, and then knowing that this kind of memory was resident all the way up into all of our lifetimes. Everybody on this call pretty much has been around when Ben Sion Wacholder was still walking the face of the earth. So what does this do to our appreciation of our own sacred literary heritage? And by that, I mean the Gospels, what we know about Jesus from his contemporaries. Is it make-believe? Is it something that people came up with later and wrote down? Does it contain lots of mistakes and errors that people's faulty memories caused parts of the tradition to get lost, and then they had to try to rebuild it and they put in stuff that really is not original to Jesus? Or because Jesus came and ministered in a land of Israel, Jewish Hebrew speaking matrix, where that world was the world of orality and the world of, if you couldn't remember all of your oral Torah, then I'll show you texts next week. You're guilty against your own soul and you're worthy to inherit Gehenna if you forget one word of your learning. These are the kinds of things that rabbis were challenging in Jesus' day their disciples with. Don't you dare forget. Make a song out of it and sing it every day. Repeat it over and over and over. The person who has repeated his oral Torah 101 times is greater than the person who has repeated 100 times. Those kinds of words. We must remember and use the very words given to us by our teacher. We can't even revise it to bring it up to speed with new words coming into the language or old words falling out of the language. That's the kind of stuff that you're going to see next week when we meet together, same bat time, same bat station. I hope that this brief discussion it ends up giving you a greater appreciation for the foundational texts of our faith, which are the Gospels, the 4 canonical Gospels, because they are grounded and rooted in this marvelous, wonderful, voluminous, accurate Jewish memory that existed in the 1st century in rabbinic circles. So I'm going to stop share so that I can at least see you as you start dialing out. God bless you this week. Give thought to those things. Look forward to next week when you're actually seeing the text that my comments are based on. And try to spin out the ramifications of that. If that's what we've got in our 4 Gospels, we really have 4 Dead Sea Scrolls. We've got ancient texts that really are reflecting the realities of an early 1st century Jewish Christian movement that was capable of memory feats that we have no idea of. And I had the privilege of seeing it firsthand in the life of my Dr. Father Ben-Zion Wacholder, in the lives of people like Dr. Alfred Gottschalk and Werner Weinberg and Yitzhak Yerushalmi, and on and on and on, these luminaries, remnants of the Holocaust, who had this stuff. They had a built-in DVD with all of that. You know what I have to crunch digit, numbers to get. Those guys had it drilled into them, and they could quote it ad nauseum as much as you want, as long as you want. They could just keep on quoting the stuff, word for word, line after line, page after page of this material that we're actually engaged in studying together. Have a wonderful week. Serve him and represent him. And we'll see you again, same time, same station next week.
Thank you. Will you be
God bless
posting
y'all.
a recording somewhere?
I did record this. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with it. If it's something that is needed by somebody, then give me a chance to get back from the funeral and email me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be praying for you guys.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks to all of you for showing up and helping me have fun tonight.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you. May your father-in-law's memory be blessed.
Thank you. Always like it when the kids come into the room at the end. It's like, hooray, they let me out of the toy box. They unlocked the closet.
Dr. Nunnally, quick question.
Yeah, Rod.
Last time I was in Israel, I studied with someone that threw a concept at me. I want to get your opinion that Joseph was widowed and that he was in his 40s when he and Mary were betrothed, and that's why he disappears early in the narrative, because of his age.
Okay, well, based on the ancient documents, it was, I'm not going to say typical, but it wasn't unusual for an older man to marry a younger woman. However, you also get in the teachings of the rabbis that if a young man has reached the age of 18 and he's not already married, then he's already disobeying God, because he's supposed to get married and start having kids. So there were young men who were getting married. Where does that tradition come from? It comes from Catholicism, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that the brothers and sisters of Joseph and of Jesus, Joseph and Mary's kids, are actually classified as stepbrothers and sisters, or even cousins. You hear that in some strains of Catholicism. It's an attempt to preserve what the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary, which is an extra biblical doctrine. So I don't. That's not something that we really have to work really hard at trying to maintain, because even Roman Catholic scholars like Joseph Fitzmyer and others are now fully openly admitting that the word that is used, adelphoi in Greek, the word brothers, can never be used as cousins and can't be used as stepbrothers either. So there's some interesting cracks in all of those theories that are coming into even Roman scholarship at this point. Another one would be Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who's also publicly made that kind of admission. Two very prominent historical Jesus scholars, by the way, Jerome Murphy O'Connor and
Fitzmyer.
Joseph Fitzmyer, yeah.
Yeah, I'm familiar with both of those. What's your understanding of the Aramaic scripture, Armenian scriptures, and how they add a lot of the extra biblical stuff that gives us some insight into the life of the New Testament.
Yeah, I'm not that well studied on it, but because you have, like you have that old church Slavonic Enoch and various things like that, that don't find any parallels in the Ethiopic tradition or in the Hebrew, the original Hebrew that we find like at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I wonder if that's not some legendary material creeping into that literary tradition that is unique to that particular group of Christians.
Okay. Would you say the same about the Coptic?
Quite possibly, yeah. There is the Coptic traditions are every bit as much as prolific as creative as the Slavonic and the Armenian, in the sense that they are generating lots of biblically based stuff, kind of biblically oriented stuff. The Gnostic Gospels that come from Nag Hammadi, for example, that stuff is largely coming out of a Hellenized or a Neoplatonized version of Christianity that we would call heretical Gnosticism, the Gnostic wing of Christianity. And you read in the Gnostic Gospel, the secret Gnostic Gospel of St. Thomas, or you read in this new Gospel of Judas that was published not terribly long ago, or the Gospels of Philip, the Gospel of Bartholomew, that kind of thing. Some amazing flights of fancy that would never be engaged in by Jews from the land of Israel that are, from a Hebrew speaking, background and connected to the world that Jesus was associated with.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful, keeping me connected to the Hebraic side, because my background's in the languages. And so when I'm around some of these people and they start stretching that, I just need to remember to keep it rooted in the Hebraic mindset.
When it comes to the biblical Gospels, the Greek of those Gospels can really easily be what's called retroverted back into Hebrew. People from all the way back in the days of Gustav Dalman in the 1800s have had a really difficult time maintaining the Aramaic Jesus speaking theory, because Aramaic speaking Jesus theory that Jesus' mother tongue was Aramaic, because a lot of the things, the stuff that we read in Greek is not easily retroverted back into Aramaic, but it goes into Hebrew like hand and glove. The same thing can be said, the same approach can be said of these, the Gnostic Gospels or the Armenian editions or the Coptic editions. A good question to ask oneself, because we're trying to stick with evidence and not just, this is my opinion, or this is how I feel, or this is the way I was brought up. You're trying to go with evidence, right? Is to go back to those original languages and see how easily those sections that are unique to the Coptic works or unique to the Slavonic works or the Armenian works, and see how easily that fits back into, that is retroverted back into Hebrew. And my hunch is this: I'm not an expert in any of those languages that we just talked about, Slavonic, Armenian, or Coptic. But my hunch is that those people who are experts in those languages and are very good at Hebrew, they would have difficulty, because I have a feeling that those additions are not original to the original Hebrew Jesus tradition.
Thank you.
Dr. Robert Lindsay, do you know his work? Okay, he has that, you know, the Hebrew Mark that he did, is his first book, I think. And he found that the entire Gospel of Mark goes very easily back into the Hebrew language.
Right. Yes.
Quite amazing.
Yeah.
He was my pastor when I lived in Israel.
Oh, really?
Yep.
I've gone to church there some, and
The Narkey Street Baptist congregation.
yeah, and then of course the Jerusalem Perspective. That's where I get a lot of the information about Dr. Lindsay.
Robert Lindsay, yes. Yes, and may his memory be blessed as well.
Yeah.
He's an amazing man.
Thank you.
I studied with some of the greats, man. I feel so privileged. Dr. Lindsay was my pastor. I studied with David Biven,
Yeah.
Brad Young, who's at ORU.
Yeah, that's where I went to school.
With Chana Safrai, Jim Monson, Anson Rainey. If any of us make it to heaven, it's going to be a great reunion.
I'm very familiar with a lot of those guys. I read their stuff. So
yeah, they're special people. They don't make those kind anymore.
Yeah, amen. Stephen Notley, familiar.
Steve Notley is a dear friend of mine. We've worked together. I talked to him. I was talking to him in the parking lot of my doctor the other day. I was talking to him on the phone about a issue that we were trying to troubleshoot.
We were at the dig with him 2 years ago.
At El Araj?
Yes.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
But maybe at some point you can share with the group some of the things that are coming out of Tel El Araj. That started out as an excavation. It's not so much anymore, but as an excavation with Moti Aviam. You know him, right?
Yeah.
I mentioned him earlier in the
And Gabi
discussion.
Barkai.
Gabi Barkai.
He was there the whole time we were there. So
Gabi
I
was.
sat and talked to him for, of course, I took a class from him at JUC, Gabi Barkai. So
yes. Yeah, I love Gabi's accent because it's not American English. It's kind of a British accent that he picked up in Hungary or wherever. Really interesting guy. Love him to death. That'd be good to hear, some, reports back from the field.
thank you, brother.
Yes, my pleasure, Rod. Okay, y'all, I got to go home and pack. So,
Thanks for teaching us.
shalom, shalom, y'all. My pleasure.